My parents stole my college fund for my brother's startup. So I rose on my own and taught them a lesson when they came back begging pathetically. When I got the acceptance letter from Stanford University, it was one of the happiest days of my life. I'd worked so hard to get to this point, pulling all-nighters, spending my weekends at the Riverside Public Library, skipping out on parties to ace every advanced placement exam. This was the payoff, the validation of years of grinding through calculus, chemistry, and computer science courses. The biomedical engineering program was one of the best in the country, and I was ready to start this new chapter. I imagined myself walking across that beautiful California campus, moving into Wilbur Hall, meeting brilliant minds from around the world, and diving headfirst into groundbreaking research. The first person I told was my mom, Linda. She gave me the biggest smile, hugged me tight, and said she was proud. My dad, Robert, nodded and said, "That's my girl," in that way he always did when I accomplished something. He liked to take credit for everything. Everything seemed perfect at first, but when I brought up tuition at our kitchen table in our suburban Denver home, their reactions weren't what I expected. I still remember sitting there with my acceptance packet laid out, showing them all the details about costs and scholarships. I was excited, maybe a little nervous about the $70,000 annual price tag, but I thought we were just going to figure out the logistics together. That's when my dad let out this heavy sigh. "We just don't have the money for Stanford right now, sweetheart," he said, avoiding my eyes. For a second, I didn't understand. What did he mean? I thought there was a fund for this. They'd been telling me since I was 12 that they were saving for my education. My dad started rambling about how his accounting firm had been struggling lately. Mom chimed in, mentioning my brother Derek's medical bills from his recent appendectomy. It was like they had rehearsed this excuse because they passed the explanation back and forth like a relay race. The more they talked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't news they had just discovered. "But you've always said you've been saving since I was a kid," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You always told me not to worry because you were setting money aside for college." Mom couldn't meet my eyes. She stared at her manicured nails like they were suddenly the most fascinating thing in our maple dining room. "We had to use that money for emergencies," she said softly. "Honey, I'm so sorry." It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I sat there stunned, trying to process what they were saying. "Maybe you could take out some loans," my dad suggested, "or start at Colorado State and transfer later. Lots of people do that." I nodded, but it was automatic. My head was spinning with disbelief and crushing disappointment. For the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching financial aid and loan options. I started looking into cheaper schools, even though it felt like giving up on my dreams. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't sit right with me. My parents had always been so supportive of my education before. They were the ones who pushed me to aim for Ivy League schools, to join the robotics club, and take every AP class Lakewood High offered. Now, they seemed almost indifferent, like my future wasn't their problem anymore. The change in their attitude was too sharp to ignore. They didn't ask about my backup plans, didn't offer to help me figure out alternatives. Every time I brought up college, they either changed the subject or gave me some vague platitude about how everything would work out. One evening, I overheard them talking in our living room while I was getting a glass of water from the kitchen. Dad was saying something about Derek's big opportunity and how they needed to support him now because it was his time to shine. Mom agreed, saying she believed it was a worthy investment. At first, I thought they were talking about his recovery, but the way they phrased it felt off. I tried to push the doubts out of my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the seed was planted and it kept growing. I started noticing little things, like how they perked up every time Derek called to talk about his revolutionary app idea. Meanwhile, my Stanford acceptance was treated like junk mail. Then one Saturday afternoon, I was in Dad's home office looking for my birth certificate. I needed it for financial aid forms, and Mom said it was probably in the filing cabinet. As I flipped through the folders, I stumbled across one labeled with Derek's name. I know I shouldn't have opened it. I wasn't trying to snoop, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found a stack of papers that made my stomach drop to the floor. It wasn't medical bills like I expected. It was an investment contract for Next Gen Solutions LLC, Derek's tech startup. My parents had poured $180,000 into my brother's app development company. And the kicker? The date on the contract was 2 weeks before they told me my college fund was gone. My hands were shaking as I read through the details. They had invested everything they had saved for me, money they'd promised would secure my future, into Derek's business venture for something called a social media optimization platform. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. All those years of hearing them talk about how important education was. All those late nights I spent studying because they told me it would pay off. I put the file back where I found it and left the office, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. For the rest of that day, I couldn't even look at them. After finding that investment contract, I couldn't look at my parents the same way. Everything about them felt fake. Their smiles, their reassurances, even their so-called apologies about the college fund. I kept replaying that conversation over and over in my head, how they sat there telling me they couldn't afford to send me to school while knowing they'd already handed my future over to Derek. For days, I debated whether to confront them. Part of me wanted to scream, demand to know how they could do this to me, but another part wasn't ready for that conversation. So I started digging deeper. I spent hours trying to piece things together, going through bank statements I found in the same filing cabinet. The numbers were all there, clear as day. Every penny they had set aside for my college fund was gone, transferred into some business account tied to Derek's startup. I wasn't angry at Derek initially. I figured he probably didn't even know where the money came from. But the fact that my parents had made that choice, had prioritized his pipe dream over my education, made my blood boil. Then there were the conversations I overheard late at night when they thought I was asleep. My parents would talk about how the risk was worth it and how they believed Derek's startup would pay off big in the long run. Dad kept saying things like, "This is our best chance to set him up for life." Set him up for life. What about me? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting in my room staring at that Stanford acceptance letter, and it felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of something I couldn't have. That's when I decided I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The next day, I was sitting at the kitchen table when Dad walked in. Mom was at her book club, and it was just the two of us. I figured it was as good a time as any. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from his coffee, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" I hesitated for a second, then said, "How much did you guys invest in Derek's business?" For a split second, he froze. It was subtle, but I caught it. He quickly recovered, setting his coffee down and giving me this confused look. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I saw the papers, Dad. The investment contract, the dates." His face hardened, and for the first time in my life, I saw him drop the loving father act. He wasn't apologetic or ashamed. He was defensive. "That's none of your concern," he said flatly. "It's my concern when you used my college fund to do it," I shot back. "You told me there wasn't any money for school, but there was enough to gamble on Derek's startup." "It wasn't a gamble," he snapped. "It was an investment. We believe in your brother's potential. This could be life-changing for our whole family." "And what about me?" I demanded. "What about my future? Or does that not matter to you anymore?" He didn't answer. He just sat there glaring at me like I was being unreasonable. At that moment, I realized there wasn't going to be an apology. He didn't feel bad about what he'd done. When Mom got home from her book club that evening, I confronted her too. She cried, of course. Linda always cried when she didn't want to take responsibility for something. She kept saying things like, "We thought it was the best choice for the family, and we didn't mean to hurt you." But all I could think was, "You didn't think about me at all." Over the next few days, the tension in our house became unbearable. Dad avoided me completely. Mom acted like a martyr, sighing dramatically whenever I walked through the room. And Derek, well, Derek was completely oblivious to the whole thing, calling from his apartment in Boulder to update them on his latest breakthrough with user interface design. Eventually, I realized there was no point in staying. I couldn't trust them anymore. They didn't see me as a priority, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. So I started making plans to leave. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening when Derek came home for dinner, acting like everything was normal. He walked into our house with that confident, easygoing smile he always had, completely unaware of the storm brewing under the surface. My parents greeted him like he was some Silicon Valley celebrity, asking about his latest app features and showering him with praise. I sat at the dinner table, silently fuming, watching the whole scene play out like I was invisible. Mom had made Derek's favorite meal, barbecue ribs with her special sauce and cornbread. The same meal she used to make for my birthday. Dinner started as it always did, with Mom asking Derek about his progress. He launched into a story about potential investors from California who were interested in his platform. He talked about user engagement metrics, venture capital meetings, and how proud he was of everything he'd accomplished. My parents hung on his every word, their faces lighting up like he'd just announced he'd cured cancer. I couldn't take it anymore. So Derek, I said, cutting through the conversation, how much did Mom and Dad invest in your startup? The room went dead silent. Derek froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Dad's face turned bright red, and Mom's smile vanished instantly. What? Derek asked, clearly confused. He looked between me and our parents, trying to figure out what was going on. You heard me, I said, my voice steady but sharp. How much of my college fund did they pour into your business? Enough, Dad snapped, slamming his hand on the table. This isn't the time or place to bring this up. It's exactly the time and place, I shot back. You think I'm just going to sit here and play along like everything's fine? You lied to me. You told me there was no money for school, and then you gave it all to him. Derek looked stunned. Wait, what? I didn't know that money was for your college, he said, turning to our parents. Is that true? The truth came spilling out in angry, painful waves. I told Derek everything, about the investment contract, the lies, the way they dismissed my future like it didn't matter. My voice got louder with each revelation until I was practically shouting. That's enough. Dad barked, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You're acting like a spoiled brat. Do you have any idea how hard we've worked to support this family? Support this family. I laughed bitterly. You mean support Derek? I'm done being the afterthought. I pushed back my chair and stood up, grabbing my purse from the counter. You can keep your money. I don't need it. I'll figure out my own future, and it'll be without you. That night, I packed up my life into 2 duffel bags and my old Honda Civic. I didn't have much, just clothes, my laptop, textbooks, and about $800 I'd saved from my part-time job at Barnes & Noble. I didn't have a plan, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house for another second. I slept in my car that first night, parked behind a 24-hour Walmart in Aurora. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt better than being under their roof. For the first time in months, I felt free, not in a happy way, but in a way that meant I didn't have to rely on people who didn't value me. The first few weeks were a blur of uncertainty and desperation. I lived out of my car, parked in different lots each night, spending my days at the public library applying for jobs and trying to figure out what to do next. My savings disappeared fast when you factor in food, gas, and the occasional cheap motel when sleeping in the car became unbearable. I ignored every call and text from my parents. Mom sent long, emotional messages about how she loved me and didn't want our family to fall apart. Dad, true to form, was all about tough love. You need to grow up, he texted once. The real world isn't going to coddle you. It was infuriating. He acted like I was the one who had done something wrong. Eventually, I ended up in Fort Collins, about an hour north of Denver. I hadn't planned to stop there, but I ran out of gas and money at the same time, so it felt like fate. The college town had a different energy, young, optimistic, full of possibility. I walked into a diner called Murphy's, desperate for work. The manager, a weathered woman in her 50s named Pat, took one look at me and said, "You look hungry and desperate. Perfect. You start tomorrow." I didn't even ask about the pay. I just nodded, thanked her, and spent the last of my cash on gas and a pack of ramen. The work wasn't glamorous, waiting tables, cleaning up after the late-night crowd, dealing with drunk college students, but it was mine. I lived off tips, saving every penny I could. A week later, I picked up a second job at a local auto repair shop, helping with paperwork and basic maintenance. The owner, Carlos, was a kind man who didn't ask too many questions about why an 18-year-old girl was working 2 jobs and living in her car. For the first time in my life, I wasn't relying on anyone else. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and determination. I worked from early morning at the shop to late at night at the diner. My body ached, and I barely had time to think, but in some strange way, I felt proud. I was surviving on my own terms. Months passed, and life started to feel more manageable. I'd saved enough to rent a tiny studio apartment above a used bookstore. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, and a kitchenette, but it felt like a mansion compared to my Honda. I started taking night classes at Colorado State University, figuring out how I could work toward an engineering degree while supporting myself. It wasn't Stanford, but it was progress. Then one day, out of nowhere, my phone rang with Mom's number. I almost didn't answer. I'd been ignoring their calls for months, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Margaret, it's me," came Mom's voice, shaky and unfamiliar. "I left your father." I almost dropped the phone. "What?" "I left him," she repeated, like she could barely believe it herself. "I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. I should have done this months ago." This wasn't the woman I'd grown up with, the one who always backed Dad no matter how wrong he was. "Why now?" I asked. "Because of you," she said, her voice breaking. "Because I can't keep living with what we did to you. Watching you leave, knowing how much we hurt you, it made me realize how wrong everything has been for a long time." She told me she'd filed for divorce and sold the house. Half of the proceeds were mine, about $90,000. "It should have been your college fund in the first place," she said. "I hope it's enough for you to start over." I was speechless. For months, I'd been grinding just to survive, and now she was offering me a lifeline. But I wasn't sure I was ready to trust her again. "What about Derek?" I asked. Mom sighed. "His startup failed 6 months ago. Turns out his app wasn't as revolutionary as he thought. Your father is furious about losing the investment, but he still won't admit he was wrong." Derek feels horrible about everything. He wants to talk to you." Over the next few weeks, I watched as Mom followed through on her promises. The money came through, enough to cover several years of tuition and living expenses. I enrolled full-time at Colorado State's engineering program. It wasn't Stanford, but the professors were excellent, and I was finally back on track toward my dreams. Mom moved to Fort Collins too, renting a small apartment across town. She got a job at a local accounting firm and started rebuilding her life. We didn't talk every day, but when we did, it felt different, more honest. She wasn't the same person who had enabled Dad's favoritism for years. As for Derek, he called me eventually. His startup had indeed failed spectacularly, burning through the entire $180,000 investment. He was back to living with Dad, working as a junior developer for a local software company. When we finally talked, he was genuinely remorseful. "I didn't know it was your college money," he said. "If I had known, I never would have taken it. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I've been the golden child for so long, I never stopped to think about how unfair it was to you." College was challenging, especially while working part-time at the bookstore to cover expenses Mom's contribution couldn't handle. But it felt incredible to be back on track, working toward a future I could be proud of. Some nights, I'd sit in my apartment surrounded by calculus textbooks and circuit diagrams, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 years. The pain of my parents' betrayal was still there, but it didn't define me anymore. I'd learned to rely on myself, to fight for what I wanted even when the odds were stacked against me. More importantly, I'd learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust, respect, and actually showing up for each other. My relationship with Mom continued to improve slowly. She was genuinely trying to make amends, attending my graduation ceremonies, celebrating my achievements in ways she never had before. It would never be the same as if the betrayal had never happened, but it was something. Derek and I eventually rebuilt our relationship too, though it took time. He used his painful startup failure as a learning experience, eventually finding success as a software engineer at a renewable energy company in Denver. He never stopped apologizing for his role in what happened, even though I'd forgiven him. As for Dad, he never reached out. According to Mom, he was still convinced he'd made the right choice and blamed me for destroying the family. I couldn't bring myself to care. He'd chosen his pride over his daughter, and that wasn't something I could forget. 3 years later, I graduated summa cum laude with my degree in biomedical engineering. I landed a position at a medical device company in Boulder, working on innovative cardiac monitoring systems. It wasn't the exact path I'd originally planned, but it was mine, built through my own determination and resilience. At my graduation ceremony, Mom was there in the audience, crying tears of pride. Derek came too, bringing his girlfriend and a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite. Even Pat from the diner showed up, beaming like a proud aunt. Dad wasn't there, of course. But as I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, I realized I didn't need his validation anymore. I'd built my own success, my own life, my own definition of family. Standing there in my cap and gown, I thought about that 18-year-old girl who'd slept in her car behind a Walmart, scared and heartbroken but determined to survive. She would be so proud of where we ended up. The best victory isn't just proving others wrong, it's proving to yourself that you're stronger than anything they can throw at you. And that, to me, was worth more than any college fund they could have given me.